Good evening. Good evening to all here in the room. Good evening to our online public. My name is Adriana Di Stefano, and we are opening this afternoon the session for the discussion of diploma di licenza di secondo livello here at Scuola Superiore di Catania. We have with us Professor Francesca Longo. She's our Vice Rector, and also she's presenting the candidate of this afternoon, Dr. Giulio D'Arrigo. We have also with us in our final commission Professor Marcello Carammia, I'm always wrong. Carammia, sorry, Marcello, and University of Catania Department of Political Sciences. I'm chairing this session as Dean of the class of Social Sciences and Humanities here at our School of Advanced Studies, and presenting Giulio D'Arrigo. He's a former student from the Department of Political Science. He graduated with Francesca Longo quite recently, in a way. Yes, time is running, Giulio. His course of study was Global Politics and Mediterranean Relations, and is presenting today a final thesis on conflict management and agenda setting in the European Union, the case of minimum wages. So we are going to leave the floor to Giulio for his presentation, but we want first to introduce to our room Professor Sebastian Prinsen, University of Utrecht. Thank you, Sebastian, for being with us, and welcome. He's joining us as opponent of the thesis of Giulio. And thank you for your time and for your kind availability. Of course, we look forward to having you here in presence in the next future. And so it's a tradition here to have a formal invitation for all members of our final commission. So we hope to have you here in Catania quite soon, with great pleasure, of course. So Giulio, we are here for you. Let's start your presentation, about 20-25 minutes. You have the floor. Take the mic
directly. Okay. Can you hear me? Also online? Okay, great. Can we? Yes. Okay. Direction. Thank you very much, Professor Di Stefano. So I will kick off directly with the puzzle of my research. But before that, I would like to thank all the people who are here, and thank to the Scuola Superiore for being a very important part of my career and my life in the last 5, 6, almost 7 years. Let's start with the remote. Okay, great. Let's start with the puzzle of my research. We know, and this is also what is taught generally in the introduction courses in EU politics, that the European Union has a very diverse, very heterogeneous polity with very diverse interests that participate in its political process. A diversity of interests in order to produce a successful and shared policy outcome has to implement a system of consensual policy making. The European Union is not considered to be a majoritarian political system, but rather a consensual one. And considering in the light of these, conflictual issues are often avoided or not addressed by the European Union. This is also a reason that is often highlighted when we talk about the failures of the European integration process. Certain issues that are considered to be too conflictual, too close to the national sovereignty of nations, of member states that constitutes the Union are not often addressed, or when they are addressed, often the policy doesn't produce effective outcome. In the light of these, it is quite surprising and puzzling that in 2022, the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, have adopted a directive on adequate minimum wages. We know that at the domestic level, minimum wages are issue within the broad scope of social policy. Social policy regards welfare state. It is often a conflictual issue at the national level, very closely related to certain traditions that are proper of the national contract, so-called, or yes, that are conflictual, that regard the trade union, the relation between trade unions and employers. It is a conflictual issue. How did the European Union be able to come up with a directive, with a policy in this area? In my dissertation, I tried to study the agenda setting part of this process. So how could such a conflictual issue be included in the agenda of the European Union? So I did not deal with the following part of the public policy process, so decision-making, implementation. I focused on the first stage. Before going into the analysis, it is appropriate to take a step back and to say a few words about the overall institutional framework we are in. We are talking about regulatory policy making of the European Union. What does it mean? The integration process has been quite patchy and uneven, and as a consequence of this, European policies are not made according to a consistent and always present set of institutional rules. There are several of them. Also, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union somehow reflects this diversity of policy-making procedures. The most characteristic one, and probably also the most frequent one, is the so-called regulatory policy making. So, recurring to a classical concept in public policy analysis, regulatory policies that are neither distributive nor redistributive are at stake. The European Union does not have a considerable budget that can support a systematic distributive or redistributive policies. Therefore, the main part of the EU policy product is regulation. Regulation, that is regulation, I don't mean regulation in the legal sense. I mean regulation in a broader policy sense. Regulation that is produced through procedures that mainly correspond to the ordinary legislative procedure, that in the traditional theories of regulatory policy making, and I'm referring to what Maione especially said in his book Regulating Europe, procedures that tend to depoliticize issues and to focus on efficiency improvement rather than distribution. So there is this Pareto efficiency framework. Regulatory policies put in action by the European Union, by the institutions of the European Union that have been delegated by member states, are intended to increase the overall product, somehow economic product of the system, that is increase the efficiency without engaging with the distribution of the resources, that being a closely political matter has to be dealt with by national governments that are those democratically accountable. Maione's reading was quite technocratic in a sense, ruled out the possibility that the European Union engaged with distributive issues. The European Union should not be a politicized entity for Maione, but simply a technical policymaker. This reading has been challenged by the developments of the history of the Union. We know that the European Parliament is typically a very political and politicized institution, that within the European Commission there are political partisan actors. More recently, I selected this quote that I consider very representative by Mabet and Schäffle. The political nature of regulatory processes comes from the inevitable distributive consequences of regulatory decisions. In other words, it is quite naive to consider regulation as something that only increases the overall efficiency of the system. Regulatory policies also directly or indirectly affect the distribution of the resources. So they affect the distribution means that there will be a distributive conflict that has to be managed. Somebody will win from a certain regulatory act, somebody else will lose. In the light of this, conflict, therefore, is a feature of policymaking in general, in nation states, of course, but in the light of what I have said so far, also of the European Union as a system and of regulatory policymaking of the European Union. I'm not talking about other policy modes like the intergovernmental ones that function according to different logics. I find this framework by Eberlein and Radaelli quite compelling. I adopted it in my thesis. They talk about 3 dimensions of conflict in the European Union public policy. There is a distributional one, that is what I just said, who gets what, so about who wins and who loses. Institutional conflict that is also proper of the European Union. Should the EU deal with this issue or not? Should member states do it? And if the European Union is entitled to do so, according to which procedures? A third line of conflict is the ideational one. Ideational is properly about ideas, cognitive orientations. That is also a very classical way to conceive conflict. Lines of conflicts, in order to produce outcomes, have in such a heterogeneous and fragmentary system of the European Union, where reaching a majority is a difficult endeavor, be managed. And they identify 2 broad categories of conflict management strategies. We have aggregative strategies, and they identify issue-based aggregation. That is basically what we call package deals. So aggregation of actors that focus on different issues by attaching those issues to each other. Arena-based aggregation, so the constitutions or the quest for venues where actors can gather and share and produce shared understandings and therefore shared policy outcomes, or at least policy strategies. And another category, the one of transformative strategies, where the perceptions and the individual preferences are changed over time. So we have socialization, that is a very common concept in social sciences. The perceptions, the visions of different actors that start from different points tend to converge. Reframing, that is also a very popular concept in agenda setting studies. It is about the definition of a certain issue in order to make it more appealing to different categories of actors. And finally, quite a peculiar concept, that is the one of proceduralization. When an agreement on a concrete issue is cannot be found in a certain moment, actors, decision makers, can still agree on procedures through which an outcome will be achieved eventually. This is the example, especially of the open method of coordination regarding employment policies. This is a bit of framework of agenda setting. As I said earlier, I'll be focusing I focused in this dissertation on the agenda setting stage of the policy cycle. I will not go in the detail also for time constraints, but in general, I adopt this tripartite vision of agendas as Birkeland does it, and conflict is an interesting variable to analyze in this process. In general, conflict helps moving issues to the systemic and to the institutional agendas because it catches the attention of agenda setters, whereas in the decision agenda, conflict can be a more sketchy phenomenon. I adapted somehow or linked the strategies of conflict management to classical concept of agenda setting. The link was also quite straightforward because issue-based, it's about issue linkage. Arena-based about venue shopping, venue creation. Those are classical concepts of agenda setting studies. Socialization, reframing, proceduralization can be somehow considered to be forms of what Baumgartner and Jones and other students of agenda call framing. different types of framing, of course. So let's go to our case study. And as I said in the introduction, the minimum wage policies have historically been quite a contentious issue at the domestic level. Quite a contentious issue because in general, the three types of conflict that I have outlined earlier can be found at the domestic level in quite a constant way across countries. There is a distributional conflict that is very straightforward. Workers who gain from minimum wages in general versus employers who have to bear the costs of this policy. There is an institutional conflict at the domestic level. I'm not yet talking about the European level, the EU level, because there are different ways to decide whether there should be a minimum wage and how much it should be. In several countries, like in Italy, for example, minimum wages are established through collective bargaining. So the social partners, the trade unions, and the employers' organizations decide collectively, they negotiate over collective contracts that also include clauses on minimum wages. The government does not, or if yes, very marginally, intervene in the process, in the autonomy of social partners. In other countries, there are statutory minimum wages that are established directly by law. So the government somehow steps over the autonomy of social partners. This can be contentious, especially in countries where trade unions are quite strong. Finally, there is an ideational conflict that is traditionally linked to different policy paradigms in macroeconomic and social policy, so Keynesianism versus neoliberalism, more in general, the social investment approach also looks favorably at minimum wages. We are now moving to the issue at the European Union level. We have to say that European Union social policy is considered to be, and scholars have always considered it to be, a contentious policy area in general. There are debates on the overall feasibility of developing a social policy at the EU level. Fritz Scharf has somehow set a trend by saying, no, countries will never agree to share the principle to create somehow a European welfare state. Then somebody else challenged him, but this is an ongoing debate. Going more precisely to the core of the policy debate. These are data on how minimum wages and collective bargaining are at the moment where the proposal was introduced by the Commission. So January 2021, the proposal was put forward at the end of 2020. We can say, okay, the levels of minimum wages vary across European member states because of the difference in cost of living. But there are a few member states, those where, especially Italy, Austria, and the Scandinavians and Finland, where minimum wages are established by collective bargaining because their trade unions historically have been quite strong. The coverage of collective bargaining, on the other hand, is also uneven across European countries. In my dissertation, I adopted a research design, a qualitative research design based on process tracing. I tried to be as specific as possible because I wanted to reconstruct all the process also in the details and the causal somehow links between the different events. I will not summarize it in this presentation because it is not feasible. In general, I say that I identified 4 phases and earlier attempts in the 1990s and in the early 2000s before and during the financial crisis did not succeed. The Juncker Commission, that was very socially minded, the reform that introduced the minimum wage, statutory minimum wage in Germany, a country with a very strong collective bargaining tradition, in 2015, and the proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights gave momentum to this European movement in favor of the introduction of some legal act, regulatory legal act on minimum wages. That was finally proposed after the 2019 elections. The Party of European Socialists proposed it during the electoral campaign, and they were able to negotiate it to include a proposal for a directive on minimum wages in the political guidelines of the von der Leyen One Commission. That wasn't one because it was the only one at that time. In the end, so the agenda setting endeavor succeeded. I will not, as I said earlier, I'm stopping with agenda setting. I did not engage with the following parts of the policy process. Which lines of conflict did I find in my analysis? Basically, the most apparent one is an ideational conflict between different coalitions. One was more neoliberal slash ordoliberal or austerity minded, so against the expansion of social policy instruments in general, including minimum wages. Another coalition, and this coalition was represented mainly by DG ECFIN or by center-right or even more right-wing governments, but not only, as I'll say in a few minutes, versus a coalition that was more prone to social expansion that included DG employment within the commission, the center leftist parties, both in the parliament and in governments, and also a certain part of the center right. Juncker was a centrist center right, and he was very vocal about the introduction of European minimum wages. Also von der Leyen was. This is only part of the story, because another very important dimension was the institutional conflict. Should the EU deal with minimum wages? This was a line of a sub-dimension of this line of conflict. Another sub-dimension was, but if the union does engage with minimum wages, should it favor a statutory minimum wage approach or a collective bargaining approach? Here, the conflict opposed mainly the Scandinavian countries that were, even though they were leftist, very social policy minded, were strongly, fiercely opposed to further action of the European Union in minimum wage policy, because they feared that it could undermine the equilibrium that they had found in their national welfare systems through collective bargaining. That would also somehow unleash a race to the bottom that they didn't want to have. On the other hand, there were other countries that were also, some of them, like the Italian, the Gentiloni government, was quite in favor of a minimum wage policy, because it also hoped that it could open a window of opportunity to talk about the topic at the domestic level. Then that government failed, so there was no, and also it was a bit earlier than the introduction of a legislative proposal. Finally, distributional conflicts that are the main ones we have talked about is distributional conflicts regarding regulatory policy in general, actually were less apparent, but they were still there. They were less apparent because employers' organization, Business Europe at the European Union level, were less vocal in fighting against a minimum wage policy. Arguably, I was not able to gather enough data about the Business Europe position, because I wasn't able to interview anyone from there. But apparently they didn't want to engage it too publicly, because expansion of the conflict, especially in a first stage, could play against them. So they wanted to downgrade the debate. Finally, this will be the last of the second to last slide. How were these conflicts managed? Let's review the mechanisms that Eberlein and Radaelli have singled out. Issue-based aggregation. So there have been package deals between especially the center left and the center right in the European Parliament, and also among governments, regarding social policy issues in general that were included, for example, in the political guidelines of the von der Leyen Commission, in exchange for more power for the EPP, for the European People's Party, in the balancing of the top jobs. But most of all, I will say the European Pillar of Social Rights is considered to be a so-called framework agreement. That is overall an agreement that covers a broad range of topics to be addressed in a later moment, and in which actors can also commit to follow a certain policy program without immediately bearing the costs of it. But in this case, several different and also quite conflicting positions can be included. And the European Pillar of Social Rights was somehow a platform in which also a chapter on minimum wages was included. Finally, and this I think is the most important dimension of issue-based aggregation, the conflicting positions of supporters of collective bargaining-driven minimum wages and of statutory minimum wages were both happy with the results, at least in the Commission's intentions, because the final draft of the proposal that was also approved in when the directive was approved promoted both ways and allowed member states to choose among one of the two systems. So there was no clear choice by successful outcome of the process, because there was also the actors, especially in the leftist coalition, the center leftist coalition, had considered to use the European semester as another policy mode through which building a European policy on minimum wages, but the European semester at that time was still too austerity minded. It was also years later a successful choice to stress minimum wages in the electoral campaign. That is also a sort of venue to regard to the electorate to stress a topic. Socialization was actually very relevant because certain actors, especially within Germany and Italy, so countries with a strong collective bargaining tradition, the trade unions initially were skeptical, not outspokenly against, as the Scandinavians were, but still skeptical about a European policy on minimum wages. And over time, after the crisis, with also the decline of collective bargaining and the rise of atypical jobs, and also learning from other national experiences, they changed their mind. This is a typical form of socialization. As well as the general, there is, and this is still matter of debate today, apparently there is a very broad paradigm shift ongoing at the EU level, in EU fora, also within DG ECFIN, not only within DG EMPOL, from austerity policies to social policy enhancement, social investment. Finally, reframing. Reframing was very relevant, especially when it comes to framing a European policy, a European legal act on minimum wages as an instrument to protect workers from crisis, from the Euro crisis, but also later from the COVID-19 crisis. This was useful also after agenda setting in the decision-making stage. The fact that contractual autonomy and so collective bargaining and statutory minimum wages were somehow reconciled within the framework that the Commission had proposed. And finally, this is quite an important point. Actually, the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union establishes that the European Union does not have any competence in legislating regarding workers' pay. We have an act on minimum wages. How is this possible? Well, through legal technicalities, the legal services of the Commission were able to frame a legislative proposal that was accepted under, to frame, yeah, exactly, a legal proposal that was acceptable under this criteria. So finally, the issue was included in the agenda. The directive was even adopted 2 years later. 2 years later, but conflict was not fully managed because Scandinavians that were against the proposal did not join it at any moment. And even after its approval, The Danish government, later supported by the Swedish one, appealed against the proposal before the European Court of Justice, and a few days ago, the Advocate General of the Court of Justice argued that in his conclusions that the directive should be annulled because it is against the treaty. It is not the final decision yet. If it was, that would be also a harsh failure for all the advocates of minimum wages, and it could be also an interesting development, not necessarily positive. And also employers were not listened to during the process, especially in the end. The Commission adopted an approach of selective avoidance. So when employers were saying, when Business Europe was saying something within the line of what the Commission was going to do anyway, okay, otherwise we will ignore them. This was also because of the political intentions of the commissioner, especially Nicola Schmidt at that time. But on the other hand, employers have a fundamental role at the implementation stage. And also the Scandinavian governments in general, are those implementing European Union legislation at the national level. So a final question is, but if the European Union is able to produce policy outcome as it did without fully managing leaving some parts of the conflict unmanaged, this might be successful in the agenda setting and even in the policy, in the decision-making stage. But will these conflicts be detrimental in the final stage of the policy process, which is implementation? We will find out about the decision of the Court of Justice that would mean a failure of the process of the conflict management. That part of conflict that had not been management proved to be a failure, proved to so detrimental. On the other hand, of course, leaving some part of the conflict unmanaged could help to produce more ambitious policy outcomes, as indeed the European policy of minimum directive of minimum wages is. And on this uncertain note, I thank you. And
thank you, Giulio. Now the screen to Professor Prinsen. Please, Professor.
Yes. So, Giulio, I'm very happy to be able to join your defense, even though it's online from a distance. I'm honored to be part of it, and I was very pleased to read your thesis, which is on a very interesting and relevant topic, very important topic in the EU, and also is written excellently. So I can recommend anyone to read it if they have the chance. It is my task today to ask you a number of questions and also to probe a bit the argument that you put forward in the thesis. So I'm going to ask you a number of questions to also explore a bit the limits of your argument and see where we get when we do that. And I would like to start with one of your basic starting points, and that is to look at the minimum wage directive through the prism of agenda setting theory. And you also stressed in your presentation that you're looking at the agenda setting phase. However, when I look at your thesis and also what you tell now in the presentation, it seems as if you're interested in a bit more than that, because your question is basically, why did this minimum wage directive, why is it here? Why was it ever adopted? And that's more a decision-making question in a way. And also in terms of what you study theoretically and empirically, you're really interested to find out how a sufficient majority could be obtained behind this proposal for a minimum wage directive, which is, of course, a very important and crucial question. But then my question to you would be, what is the addition of agenda setting theory to your argument? Isn't it actually about decision making rather than just agenda setting alone?
Thank you for the question, which is very allows me to touch some topics I didn't have the time to develop in my presentation. Indeed, the policy process in J is interesting from the beginning until the end. Decision making, of course, is a fundamental part of it. But I decided to focus on agenda setting not only for feasibility issues, but also because in the European Union institutional system, in the regulatory policy institutional framework, since the very beginning, there appeared to be, at least in my understanding and in my vision, obstacles that made specifically agenda setting the most difficult stage of the process to overcome. And I'm referring in particular to the prohibition, the clause in the TFU, in the treaty regarding worker space, so the limitation of competencies of the union, because since the very beginning, the Commission could have said, no, we don't have the competence to work on that, so we reject it. We don't even think of including the topic in the agenda. On the other hand, of course, the conflicts, the also ongoing conflicts within the member states and among member states, that didn't help a situation that was already made very difficult by these treaty provisions. When, since the very beginning, since the Treaty of Maastricht, in the social protocol of the Treaty of Maastricht, the member states had decided to exclude the pay from, they don't say wages, they say pay, from the competencies of the EU, of the European Union in the domain of social policy. So I think that in this regard, focusing on agenda setting, it is also useful to somehow address some questions about how the European Union expands its scope of activities within social policy. That is an evolving policy domain in the European, in EU public policy. It is not about a fully established policy domain like a single market, for example. The European Union is talking about, I don't know, some very innovative topic of issue within a single market regulation, single market policy. And in that case, okay, nobody contests the fact that the European Union could legally speaking, act in that domain. In the social policy field, it is also there are obstacles not only to proper decision making, to finding the political majorities to pass a certain act, but also to include that act into the agenda and into the minds of policymakers.
Okay, thank you. I agree that agenda setting is an important part of policy processes, also in the European Union. So we fully agree there. But I'm going to push you a bit more. Because if you look at what you've done in your analysis, you focused on conflict management. Let me rephrase the question. Suppose that you had not used the concept of agenda setting or agenda setting theory, and you had applied the Eberlein-Arada-Elli framework directly to your analysis. What would have been different from what you have now?
Well, this is also a very interesting question. So if I had analyzed only the decision-making process, so after the proposal had been introduced, I think I would have lost all the conflict about conflict within member states, especially in the roots somehow of the process. And I would have already started analyzing a case, a context where political parties, for example, or certain governments, and most of all trade unions, the ETUC in particular, had already shaped their preferences regarding minimum wages. These preferences somehow had developed over time before decision-making was started. So within the long process of agenda setting. Of course, making a study on the whole policy process, or at least on both agenda setting and decision making, could have it would have been more work, and indeed it would have covered a broader a broader spectrum of empirical events that would have given even more, not only more details, but more explanatory context to the question why the act was adopted in the end. But I think that the most interesting part of this story lays before the proposal was, not only the proposal was introduced by the Commission, but even before the Commission structures started working legally speaking on the proposal. That is, for example, or also the topic of a few other studies that I have cited in my thesis regarding specifically minimum wages that had already covered that part of the story. So I wanted also to go to the roots.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the explanation and for the explanation of the choices you made there. I would like to move to a more specific question about the theory you're using, especially the concept of socialization, which is one of the part of the framework that you're using. You're applying it to the case of the minimum wage directive. And in doing so, you identify a number of instances of socialization in your analysis. So, for instance, the fact that the German government supported the directive, whereas initially it did not, but also the softening of the authoritarian position within the EU, the favorable stance of Central and Eastern European countries. Now, if I look at those examples that you give, I'm not sure if they would count as socialization in strict sense, because socialization is really when you're part of a group in which certain norms or certain ways of looking at things are shared, then you're socialized into that way of thinking. In a way, you become part of that group and start thinking the same way. But the kind of things that you discuss here, they seem to relate more to internal political dynamics within those countries. And perhaps also with learning more generally. I mean, the different approach to austerity is maybe also informed by the lessons of the financial crisis, where in hindsight it was seen that the austerity emphasis was maybe not very helpful. But in any case, it seems as if this concept of socialization is used for a broader set of phenomena than socialization in a strict sense. So I would like to invite you to tell a bit more about why you believe these are instances, examples of socialization in terms of your theoretical framework.
Thank you for the question. I understood socialization indeed as a broad concept, even a bit broader than usual, how it is usually employed in social science studies. Also because in my reading also Radaelli and Eberlein somehow framed it in this broad way in their original framework. But going specifically on the points you made, the fact of being part of a group, I think, and I perceived in the data I had the opportunity to collect and to consult, that in the case of trade unions, this is quite true. The ETUC, the European Trade Unions Confederations, was a forum somehow where trade unions from different countries, and in particular from Italy and Germany, had the chance to be exposed to pro-minimum wage positions from other smaller members of the Confederation. This did not happen for Nordic unions, as we know. That was a venue somehow where socialization happened, and socialization also regarding governments, for example, happened as an effect of the constant or the frequent interaction between different actors. So, for example, even at the domestic policy level, somehow, in my understanding, the fact that trade unions change their mind regarding minimum wages will produce an effect on social democratic parties, not only as the result of electoral logics. Of course, the social democratic party want to be in line, at least in the mainstream cases, with the trade unions, but also as the result of a broad process of a shift of a certain systems of ideas that is shared among actors from a certain position to another. Learning actually is a concept that was not present, if I remember correctly, in Eberlein's and Radaelli's framework. It is also quite interesting because Radaelli has also studied learning very much. But learning is a way, in my reading, is a way through which socialization can find a vehicle to change, to produce this convergence of visions. And in the case of the abandonment of authoritarian positions to the advantage of more pro-European, social policy positions, there was indeed an essential part of learning, but also in that case, within the European Commission, for example, this is what I was told by the interviewees. Of course, interviewees always could somehow overemphasize their position. Within DG EMPOL, they said, but DG ECFIN, also within the European semester, we had interaction, and slowly they learned, but they didn't learn from their failures, also from their failures. They learned from us, from the DG EMPOL, that pro-social policy measures were better for the overall European Union and the EU economy in particular. And the aspect of learning then is also cited in one of the other studies that I have not discussed here in the presentation, but I did in the thesis, the one by Schreurs on the critique of Scharf in why the European integration in social policy can still advance. I don't see learning as a concept that is unrelated to socialization. This is the summary of what I have just said. I don't know if you are satisfied.
Yes. Thank you for your clarification of how you understand and use this concept. Let us then move to another concept. That's a proceduralization. And in the thesis, you argue that proceduralization did not occur in this case study in the way Eberlein and Radaelli define it. So it's not a mechanism that plays a important role in your argument. However, when I look at the explanation of what proceduralization is earlier in the thesis, then you say, and I quote here, if the conflict is such that it does not allow for an agreement on a substantive policy outcome, actors can still agree on the rules of procedure through which a substantive outcome can eventually be attained. Now, looking at the minimum wage directive, I would say, isn't this exactly proceduralization? Because they did not agree on a substantive minimum wage, like it has to be so many euros, but they agreed on a procedure that every member state has to follow in order to arrive at a decent minimum wage, whatever that substantively would be. So isn't proceduralization actually what was done in this case? And is it therefore not very present in this case rather than absent?
Thank you, because in this way you also allow me to point out an omission that I made in my presentation. Right now, I didn't include this point on proceduralization in my slides because I would have said that it did not allow in the way Radaelli and Eberlein define it. I wrote it in the thesis, and let me explain what I meant with this sentence. Indeed, also when I was writing and when I was working on the dissertation, I realized that actually the minimum wage directive, I also quite explicit with that, did not set minimum wages as a national law in the domain will do, but sets rules that somehow are about the quality of procedures at the national level regarding the setting of minimum wages. and these rules may regard both statutory minimum wage setting or collective bargaining. The way Radaelli and Eberlein define a proceduralization, in my understanding of their theory, is more about broader institutional procedures that go also somehow beyond the specific policy, the specific issue that has to be achieved, has to be addressed. Their main example was precisely the open method of coordination regarding employment policy in general. So it was a very general family of issues, employment policy. Instead of giving, this was during the negotiations of the Amsterdam Treaty, if I don't go wrong, instead of including a precise and clear competence of the European Union in regulating specific working situations, working issues related to employment, the member states had set a new policy mode that could attain as a quite remote also policy outcome, in the sense that it was within, it was the explicit outcome, but it was not the possibility of achieving that outcome was not clear since the beginning. I don't know if it is clear what I'm saying. It is more general and more remote than what happened in the minimum wage directive, where they, of course, it was they framed. I read it more as an instance of framing than an instance of reframing in the conflict management framework, than instance of proceduralization, because they indeed set in the directive procedures, but these procedures are very concrete, and the outcome, that is a setting of adequate minimum wages, is still mandatory in all member states. This is not an optional or a policy mode that somehow wants to produce a recommendation like of outcomes, like the open method of coordination is. So I agree that there is a dimension of proceduralization in the empirical case, and maybe we should also think more. Maybe I could also develop more my point in my thesis about that and propose somehow a new definition, or not a new definition, but somehow working some developments on the concept of proceduralization. But according to that framework, I read it more as a case of reframing.
Okay, so if I rephrase what you just said, the proceduralization in Eberlein and Radaelli's terms has to do with the procedure that is adopted at the EU level, really, rather
Yes.
than, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
But that then would actually invite the question that you already raised yourself as part of your answer, and it is that shouldn't we then add maybe a new category, a variety of proceduralization, or maybe we call it differently, where not substantive standards are set on a member state, but a procedure is prescribed. And this is something that is used also in other areas, environmental policy. There are examples of this, and it really makes a difference. I mean, there were proposals, as you explained in your thesis, to say, well, the minimum wage has to be 60% of the median wage, or 70%, but that's not what they chose. They chose a different approach, and I think it would be a bit misleading to say that's just reframing. It's not. It's really a different way of regulating the topic. So would you, if you have to answer this now, would you be in favor of adding a new category to Eberlein and Radaelli's framework to capture these kinds of solutions to divergent preferences?
Yeah, right now, also listening to your comments, I would develop more on that part, and maybe I will be more brave in also challenging a bit the points of reference, the reference point that Eberlein and Radaelli had used to elaborate the framework. So, of course, they had written their article in 2010. 2010 wasn't too many years ago, but still EU policy making was different than today. Euroscepticism, for example, was not as strong as it is today. So maybe today the European Union, the European Commission, deploys a wider range of strategies in deciding to what extent to deal with a certain issue, to deal closely with a certain issue within a legal act. This is a bit maybe a downside of not of the agenda setting approach in general, but of some studies of them, and this is also a critique that I address to myself in saying, okay, I will study this issue. This is the issue of minimum wages. Okay, it is framed in a certain way, but I will not go too closely in analyzing the specific details because that's also a work for lawyers, not for political scientists. Actually, it is very important to adopt a more detailed approach in order, especially when it is appropriated to the research, to our research questions, because it allows us to understand the micro strategies somehow. So the strategies about really the details of the proposal, of the issue that then become a legislative proposal and eventually a law, a legal act, and to understand how within these very technical policy making instances, technical policies, the European Union and the Commission really interferes or somehow is present in the determination of levels of minimum wages in this case, but it could be any issue to the detriment of the power of national governments or national authorities in determining these levels. So yes, I would agree somehow that this issue of proceduralization should be more discussed and more elaborated, also looking at the details of not only of minimum wage directive, but also of other cases within the domain of social policy. Of course, because they are easily comparable with minimum wage, but in general, this is an approach that could be fruitful.
Okay, thank you for reflecting on that. Then I would like to ask one final question before I turn over to the other people in the room again. And it has to do with the recent development that you alluded to in your presentation, the opinion by the Advocate General on the annulment case, in which he actually concluded that, according to him, well, the directive should be annulled. Now, of course, as you already explained, the court is not bound by this. It can also come to a different conclusion. But apparently, I mean, Advocate Generals are among the best lawyers we have in Europe, and apparently a case can be made here that it does not, it's not allowed under treaties to do this. Now, if the court follows this line of reasoning by the Advocate General, wouldn't that actually support Fritz Sharp's argument that in the EU it is a lot easier to deregulate than to regulate? Wouldn't Fritz Sharp be right in the end, despite everything that you've shown about the possibility to get to this directive? I would really be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, because I found out about the Advocates General decisions only yesterday, because it has been published like in mid-January, so a few days ago. So when I was preparing my presentation, I wonder, maybe the court has there have been developments, and there were. I would stress 2 points in this regard. First, I mean, within this dimension, the court decision will really be a critical juncture. So we will see. Still the critical juncture has not happened. The first aspect that I would like to stress is that the court decision will tell us more about the role of the Court of Justice within the European Union integration process in general. I don't want to overemphasize the single case vis-a-vis the full integration process, but it might be still a relevant development, because several times in the history of the integration process, especially in the first decades, integration has taken place mainly through law, so through court decisions. And sometimes these court decisions have been criticized, especially when they were adopted by lawyers that had been trained at the national level, because of course EU law was not an established discipline yet, European Community law. So the European Court of Justice had this sort of innovation potential. Maybe lawyers here, I don't know if Professor Di Stefano will agree with me, or I'm saying some sort of blasphemy, but this is how political scientists maybe read also constitutional court of the decisions of the Court of Justice in the case of the European Union. So there was also that potential of political innovation that the Court of Justice was somehow giving to the system. Should the court, and also recently, even in the social policy domain, the Court of Justice, the social policy or in the social aspects of a common market competition policy, the Court of Justice somehow proved to be careful to the political context. I don't remember the case exactly, what the case was about, but in 2016, a few weeks or months before the Brexit referendum, the Court of Justice issued a decision that it was a case United Kingdom versus Commission, and the United Kingdom won the case, and it was I think in the book by Amandine Crespi on European social policy, the history of European social policy, there was a comment, the Court of Justice wanted to somehow signal to the United Kingdom, if you stay within the Union, you will not have to face unexpected waves of integration you didn't explicitly agree to. This is actually a double-edged phenomenon, and this leads me to the second aspect I wanted to highlight. On the one hand, the Court of Justice, yes, proved to be careful, at least approved, maybe is too a strong word, but still somehow suggested that it was careful to the overall political context. On the other hand, that decision privileged the position of the member states rather than the one of the European Commission. Also, in this case, it is a case Denmark versus Parliament and Council. So we don't know. In any case, the European Court of Justice will tell us whether it will still support, not unconditionally, of course, because it is not the case, but somehow support more supranational pro-integrationist stances rather than more single member state positions regarding some also politically sensitive topic. Regarding linking this to Fritz Scharf, yes, of course, the Court of Justice will tell us more whether Scharf theory will be confirmed or not, or at least this will be an instance of that. In any case, yeah, this is why it will be a critical juncture. In any case, of course, maybe I'm also overemphasizing a bit the case, because in general, the minimum wages directive came about throughout a wave of new regulation in the social policy domain, in a new period where social policy at the European Union level has been relaunched, not only in the regulatory policy mode, but also within other policy modes of the Union. There has been the so-called socialization of the European semester, as Zeitlin and others call it. There has been the pillar of social rights. The Next Generation EU sometimes stresses welfare state reforms that are directed to strengthening social investment. So this would, we will have to discuss whether this case will just be a case of it is about the wording of the treaty that did not allow for more action in this on this domain, or rather it is more about a general undermining by the Court of Justice of this whole social policy wave in the European Union economic and not only economic integration process. But indeed, Scharf theory is very on spot regarding these developments. we will see. Not always the Court of Justice follows, the judges follows the Advocate General's opinions. In any case.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this very interesting exchange, Giulio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And some to the Commission. Professor Caramia, Professoressa Longo.
I would discuss with Giulio on a point related to the central concept of your thesis, so conflict in policy shaping step of the European Union policy. So your findings stress that conflicts managed at EU level could come back at national level, impacting in a strong way the implementation step of the policy. So I wonder, and I ask you, if this could be considered a sort of hidden criticism to the mechanism of conflict management at the European Union, because in this sense, this conflict management model seems to fail in managing the conflict, and seems more to launch the conflict from central to national policy level.
In this case, yes, and more than a criticism to conflict management mechanisms, the not hidden argument that I somehow included in my thesis, especially then in the conclusion and in the introduction, was about the incomplete conflict management. That is something that somehow I think is meaningful not only for the European Union, but for all polities that don't have very cohesive identities or institutional systems. Also federations in general, even regional states like Italy.
Complex political systems.
Complex political systems, exactly. Of course, a single case study is not enough to make general conclusions, but it is still meaningful because somehow it also tells more about the politicization, I think, of these of EU social policies, but of EU policies in general. The issue of minimum wages has been included in the agenda, and also in a policy has been established because of the pressure of an ideational movement that included the trade unions, that included political parties, and the Party of European Socialists in particular. I didn't say this, but I wrote that explicitly in the thesis. This dissertation is a follow-up of a thesis that I made for my previous master's degree regarding the role of the Party of European Socialists, that had a central, was the policy entrepreneur in this case. Then I read this phenomenon through the lenses of party politics, but that's another story. But in any case, the deep involvement of the political party is something that we don't usually see at the European Union level, because as Princeton 2009 says in his book, the channels to the agenda in the European Union are more about governments or supranational actors within the Commission, especially, or through international organizations. Parties are less central in this. When political parties become central, politicization somehow is also about not only producing policies, but also producing symbols that maybe are not fully.
Ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So there is this aspect of ideational conflict that is also about signaling to other parties or to the electorate, we have now a directive on minimum wages. There is an implementation dimension that is very technical, very also technocratic, but political parties, to put it bluntly, don't care that much because that's also work for the technocrats, the technicians, and the bureaucrats. So this is also an ongoing development in EU politics and EU policy making in general. I can't actually find right now other cases, because I would also be interested to study it in the future, other cases where political parties have been really the leading actor in putting forward a certain policy in the European Union. But I think this is representative of an overall process that Maione had criticized on grounds that today look outdated, but still are interesting. Thank you.
So, Giulio, I had prepared a few questions, but they've all been taken by my colleagues. So I would still like to ask one question, though. It's a general question about the implications of your finding, and this connects to something that you were saying at the beginning, and then again at the end of your presentation and discussion. So this is a case of a successful use of regulatory instruments to address distributive issues or conflicts. Successful at least in the short term, so successful in getting to taking a decision, which is a lot, of course. But my question is how sustainable, in your view, in the light of your findings and of course your readings on this issue, how sustainable could this be? Does it signal the need for a change in the design of the European institutional and decision-making framework in order to address such type of issues, or could this be a new mode of decision-making / integration in these areas, in such areas?
We will see, but this is to an easy answer. But we will see also, because this is I think quite a recent process, at least regarding regulatory issues and regulatory policies, very recent processes. So I'm not able right now to figure out what the implication will be. The decision by the Court of Justice will be a moment where we can try, when we will be able to somehow figure out what will happen. Not what will happen, but what which broad developments could emerge. Regarding the overall institutional framework, whether it is appropriate to this kind of issues, well, someone would answer, I am an institutionalist, so I believe in incrementalism. But the European integration process is also about incrementalism. Not everything, but still I think it's very incremental. So, for example, the inclusion of the European Parliament within the legislative procedures that then became a co-decision procedure and then ordinary legislative procedure is also a gradual and incremental process of inclusion of more classically speaking political actors and politicizing actors in the originally technocratic and depoliticizing European Union policy making. So at the overall level, there is still a sort of clash that has not been fully solved by practice. Maybe further practice will solve it without the need of an overall rearrangement of the institutional framework. But an overall and underlying clash between this political logic that is represented by political parties, I would say, because I believe in the action of political parties to produce public policies. So political parties in the parliament and political parties also in the commission, because the commissioners are party personnel, often, almost always, and the technocratic side of the story. The technocratic side that is in the commission structures The same tension can be also observed at member state level and therefore within the intergovernmental institutions that are there are political logics. So Meloni comes from the conservative and reformist parties. She has a sort of understanding with other leaders of government, heads of government from her political family. And in some policy area, this shared understanding then becomes also a common strategy. But on the other hand, the prime minister doesn't act alone. There is a diplomatic service, an administrative service at the national level that is quite independent or less influenceable by the political orientation, the partisan orientation of the leader of the government in that moment, of the parliamentary or governmental majority. So there is this tension that maybe is proper of policy making in general in Europe, besides the European Union, but also within member states. In the case of the European Union, this gets more hot because the European Union is not a fully established polity, is something that could even fall in the future. We don't know about the future of the Union. There could be disintegration, not only stability. The fact that we talk about we always talk about integration when we talk about European Union public policy, means that every policy is also important for the existence of the definition of the nature of the EU itself. Right now, I'm not able to propose institutional solutions that could reconcile the different logics. But it is something we should talk more. And also not only academics should talk more, but policymakers, constitutional policymakers should talk more.
Well done. So we can close this session if we all agree, and reconvene everyone in 10 minutes, let's say. Thank you, Giulio. Thanks to all. And you,
Thank you.
per favore, lasciare l'aula, chiederei al pubblico di lasciare l'aula per qualche minuto e ritrovarci. Then Sebastian, we can switch another side. Thank you.
Esatto, esatto.
Te lo cedo volentieri, dammi il tempo. Giulio, Dr. D'Arrigo, here we are at the very end. Okay, Sebastian, I'm reading the Italian version of our final proclamation. Dottor Giulio D'Arrigo, la commissione è composta dalla professoressa Francesca Longo, dal professor Marcello Caramia e dal professor Sebastian Prinzen, qui riunita, oltre che da me nella qualità di presidente, ha approvato all'unanimità il suo esame di diploma e le conferisce pertanto la licenza di secondo livello nella classe delle scienze umanistiche e sociali della Scuola Superiore di Catania, con voti di 70 settantesimi e lode. Congratulazioni. E ad Maiora. And now, please, ready to sign. Bravo. Ad Maiora, and many congratulations also from the president, Professor Malfitana, on behalf of Professor Giuseppe Angilella. He was here in the room, here around, ready to adjust his tie before the before the session. And congratulations, of course, from all our community at the Scuola Superiore di Catania, our staff. You were a brilliant students here and at University of Catania. Please go ahead and be always an excellent also alumno of our association. They are waiting for you. Please join the alumni association soon. We always appreciated your style, I would say, your deep sense of community. So stay close to Villa San Saverio and to us also in your further career. Congratulations. If you want to join.
Yeah. I know Giulio since his first step in our universities, and I appreciated not only his sincerity in study, but also his stability in achieving his results. And then I think that you will give to our university and to our Scuola Superiore the right place across the world. And auguri.
I don't have much to add. I just want to say it's been a pleasure to work with Giulio in my capacity as a professor at the BA. I wasn't lucky enough to have him when I joined the master program, but I was part of a committee of his dissertation there nonetheless. And it's been a pleasure also to see him grow and achieving important successes already. Take it as a starting point. So enjoy and congratulations, but also keep working hard for the future, and I wish you all success.
Thanks, Professor. You can hear us. You can hear us. Okay. I thank you again, and arrivederci.
Thank you, Sebastian, and see you soon in Catania for your seminar that you kindly accepted to give to our new students in political science. We have another 2 students in political science enrolled at the Scuola Superiore, and we wait for you and for your seminars. Thank you. You are, for my classroom in policy of the European Union, you are a book in the sense that my students have your books as textbook in classroom. So in the next, in the near future, you will meet them personally, and I am very grateful for that. Thank you, Sebastian, and see you soon.
Yes, maybe if I may, I'm looking forward to coming to Catania and also meeting you and the students. And maybe before I leave, a small, a message for Giulio. I can only repeat what I said when we were discussing internally. This was really a very brilliant defense, and you have a very impressive command of the EU, of EU theory, of how EU works in practice. And I wish you all the best in the future steps that you will take after these graduations. So congratulations, Giulio.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vel, for accepting to be here. It has been a pleasure for me to receive your comments, and I'm looking forward to meeting you soon. May I also thank the commission, the committee, Professoressa Longo, Professor Calamia. Thank you for not only for your role now, but throughout the university career, and we will of course keep in touch and in contact. Grazie, Professoressa Di Stefano, that represents the Scuola Superiore. I'll continue speaking in English so that Professor Princeton can understand, still understand. I would like to thank gli allievi e le allieve, the students, because they have been my reference point throughout these 5 plus 1.5 years. And if today I am what I am is thanks to you, so grazie mille. Sono molto commosso.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.